Hello and welcome to the Level 6 Science Apprenticeship session at the Science Apprenticeship Conference 2023. My name's Simon Jukes and I'm the Managing Director of Marshall Assessment. And today we're going to discuss apprenticeship plans and endpoint assessments. And this in particular is going to be for those individuals that are on a Level 6 Science Apprenticeship, although a lot of the information is generic across Level 6 apprenticeships. Some of the assessment hurdles may differ slightly depending on your actual apprenticeship. And today we're going to use the laboratory scientist degree apprenticeship as our example, where we do look specifically at a particular standard. Okay, so what are we going to have a look at? Effectively, we're going to try and cover apprenticeship standards in general. IFATE, who are they, what do they do, why are they there? Assessment plans, where to find them, knowledge, skills, behaviours, and then we'll hopefully quickly move through that to get into the assessment types, have a look at assessment criteria and how you're going to be graded, and what you can do hopefully to improve your chances of a really successful outcome. So apprenticeship standards then are effectively managed and regulated by an arm's length organisation known as the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. And they look after each and every single one of those apprenticeship programmes across all sectors, not just science. And effectively, the information that they hold will describe all of the occupational profiles, the knowledge, skills and behaviours that go into each of the apprenticeship programmes. And they'll also include information about how individuals will be assessed. They'll hopefully in there hold information about professional recognition, which for science is really important, and for scientists is really important. And so all of the information that an apprentice would need to know, that a training provider would need to know, and an endpoint assessment organisation would need to know is all contained within there. And from time to time, they will regularly look at those apprenticeship standards and they'll put them through a review, which might be a small update or it might be quite a larger update depending on where the sector is and how those apprenticeship programs have performed over the previous 3, 4, 5, 6 years or so. So apprenticeship milestones in general, for those of you that have been on programme for a decent amount of time, you'll already understand all of this. For those of you that are relatively new, you will know that there effectively is quite a long period of training delivery, what we would call the practical period. And at that start point of your apprenticeship, that's really what the training provider is interested in, along with the employer, is getting you through that period of development so that you are learning those knowledge, skills and behaviours, and also working on any additional qualifications that might be embedded into your apprenticeship standard. Some standards may have a mandated academic qualification, which you have to do in order to get to the end of the practical period, or the gateway, as we would call it. Other apprenticeship standards may have that need, that mandated need for an academic qualification removed, which effectively is there and is designed to allow employers a bit more flexibility in what they're trying to achieve, and also to make sure that individuals that might be applying, they can choose the best candidates for the roles. It may well be somebody who already has an existing qualification. They don't need that. They might have existing experience in a relatively similar occupation that they can come across, and they don't perhaps need an academic qual. So that's the way it seems to be going, but not in all standards. And certainly at level 6, there's a current review, and I believe it's very likely that the degree programme, the need for a level 6 qualification will remain. Once you have completed your training delivery, that practical period, you will have this this gateway, where we'll talk about in a moment, but it's effectively a check, and then the endpoint assessment period. So you would need to understand that usually on IFATE, when you look at the standard that you are involved with, it will have your on-programme duration of a set period of months, and then it will be an expected duration for your endpoint assessment, what we call the endpoint assessment or EPA window. For kind of the higher level standards, this is often 4 to 6 months in length. So that's the time period where you'll be preparing for and then undertaking your endpoint assessment. So the road for an apprentice has a few milestones to it. First one is the initial assessment, and this is an assessment that the training provider would do against the knowledge, skills, and behaviours that are embedded in your apprenticeship program. And they want to make sure that there is sufficient new knowledge or new skill or new behaviours that will need to be developed by an individual on program. If they assess you and you already have that level of knowledge, skills and behaviours, then you are not right for that program. You are effectively already competent, and clearly the government would not want to spend a lot of their money training somebody for no reason. It would also involve initial assessment of your English and maths capabilities, whether or not you have GCSE English or maths or even higher grades in those subjects. They would still need to know where you currently sit within English and maths, because there is an emphasis from the Department of Education that every individual undertaking an apprenticeship develops further in English and maths. Then we can see the big circle of the practical period, those KSBs, knowledge, skills and behaviours, numeracy, literacy, and the all-important off-the-job training that you are allowed, which is currently 6 hours per week on average, based on a 30-hour week. So that's the minimum amount of time. If you don't work 30 hours, you work less, then the duration in total will need to be extended, so the duration of your program, so that you get the equivalent of those hours given to you to develop all of your skills through that practical period. The gateway here then, as mentioned before, it is a check that all of the mandated elements of your apprenticeship program have been delivered. You are ready, and there's a little bit of a hand in the air from you as the apprentice to say, yep, I feel that I have developed to the correct level or higher all of those knowledge, skills and behaviours. I've also completed my academic qualification, and I am ready to move into the next phase of my apprenticeship. Your employer needs to agree. So it's important that there is sufficient evidence that the employer can make an informed decision about that. And obviously your training provider needs to agree all at the same time. Once that decision's been made, then the endpoint assessment organisation gets involved. So in this case, let's say it is Marshall Assessment, we would need to check all of that evidence to make sure that all of the declarations that are needed have been made, and that, yes, you are ready to be endpoint assessed. If everything checks, you can move through the gateway into your endpoint assessment window. And that's where we're going to focus a bit more of our thoughts on for the rest of this session. Okay, so the rationale behind endpoint assessment, why is it there? There's very much a feel back in around 2012, 2013, that apprenticeships weren't quite delivering what they needed to deliver. Older versions of apprenticeships, when you finish your qualifications, you finish your apprenticeship, and there was no check, no endpoint assessment. Well, that's changed to make sure that those programs and that investment in individuals and in different sectors was actually paying off. Are employers getting value for money, and are they getting the right skills at the right time? So endpoint assessments were introduced, and these are, as it says, designed to evaluate apprentices against industry set standards. So making sure that you have the necessary skills to contribute effectively in your given role within the sector. So have you effectively developed the knowledge, skills and behaviours? And the EPA is designed to assess your ability to apply your learning in a practical setting, and that may well be in some cases through observation. It may be through projects and reports and delivering presentations, as well as responding to questioning about your role and your day-to-day activities in line with some assessment criteria. So that's where this kind of fourth cog in that whole kind of mechanism comes into play right at the end, to make sure that everything has worked effectively throughout the programme. So going back to the Institute for Apprenticeships, or IFATE's website, this is what it looks like. You can see there's a link there. If you haven't visited that site before, I can't impress upon you enough how important that it is for you to get onto this site, search out your particular apprenticeship program, and review the information about it and the all-important assessment plan, which we'll come on to. So, as I said, IFE, an arm's length government organisation, and they regulate and make sure that all of the apprenticeship programmes are current, up to date, and working effectively. If you see with a little red arrow in the top right corner, apprenticeship search, click on that and you will find yourself on a page very much like this one. You can then put in the keywords for your apprenticeship. Hopefully you know exactly what your apprenticeship program is called, but obviously you can narrow that down a little bit, have a look at the different routes. So health and science is towards the bottom of that list of boxes you can tick, and you can look through. Hopefully you know the level that you're on if you don't know the actual name of the program, and you can find it. Once you do, click on the box and then you'll be taken across to the page where all the information is about your apprenticeship. So for this level 6, I said we'd focus on laboratory scientist, the degree program. This is what the page currently looks like. It is under review as of the date that this is recorded, so that's the end of August. So I know that information about the review may come out very soon, so that might be old news, but it is currently under review status. So it is level 6. We can see that on the right hand side. We can see that the typical duration is 60 months, but it does not include the EPA period, so we'd have to delve into the assessment plan where it tell us what that is. But there's certain information on here. So very briefly, how is the apprenticeship standard actually developed in the first place? Well, it's through a trailblazer group of employers, and they feel that there is a need for a particular type of apprenticeship in their sector. They then approach IFATE and are given a form to complete, which is, well, what is the occupational profile of somebody within that role? What is that role, and what will they perform effectively? And IFATE will check that there's nothing like it already in existence. If there isn't, then great. Okay, let's go ahead and let's develop this with those group of employers. So they'll then have to understand and develop what the key duties are for that occupational profile within that sector. So there might be 10, 11, 12, 15, even more different duties that somebody performing, in this case, a laboratory scientist role, would need to perform. Once we know what those key duties are, what are the knowledge, skills and behaviours that would allow that person to perform those duties effectively? So it is quite logical in the way that it's developed. There's a lot of other detail around it. It's not quite as simple and straightforward as that. We need to obviously identify exactly what those knowledge, skills and behaviours are, and there's a lot of other wraparound as well. So that's effectively how it's created. I would draw your attention to that section on the right hand side towards the bottom that says laboratory scientist degree assessment plan. It's a PDF, and all of the different apprenticeship standards have an assessment plan, whether it's in a PDF or it's embedded in the main page, the main site. You'll be able to find it. Okay, so we mentioned the occupational profile. We also can see that there's some entry requirements. So as you can imagine, for some of the higher level apprenticeships, there may well be UCAS points that a university might expect a candidate to have in order to be eligible to go onto a program. It might not be appropriate for somebody with only GCSEs in science or A levels, but in a non-scientific subject to access and get into a degree level apprenticeship where they would need to complete a scientific degree, a Bachelor of Science, in order to complete the program. So you can see from this information that there is a bit of a detailed description of the profile, and this needs to be considered by the employer and the training provider when an employer might decide that they want an apprentice. Is that apprentice going to be working in an environment where that is a good match for the occupational profile? And it probably won't surprise that sometimes we, as an endpoint assessment organisation, may find that somebody is not in the correct working environment for that apprenticeship, which isn't great. There are things that can be done, but it's often not great. Quite rare, but it can happen. So it's important that you are happy and that it does work for you as well. So example here, the knowledge, skills and behaviours. You might see slight differences in the layout, but effectively they're the same. So we've just got a list here of knowledge, that the skills and the behaviours are lower down. So this picture is just about the knowledge elements of it. And these are the things you would need to be developed. These are the things that you would need to operate at level 6 in order to complete the program. So you should be able to use statistical techniques, probability distribution, significance testing, and confidence limits in your day-to-day job or at some point on your program, and be prepared to be able to discuss those during your endpoint assessment. You need to understand the theoretical basis for the application of the science that you are focusing on and how that might apply to research programs or other things. So it's really important that you are able to do that, and that's what you'll be working on developing throughout the 60 months on program. Okay, so the plan, the assessment plan itself then, what actually is this? Well, it's a set of rules around the evidence required, the assessment order, those hurdles that you will have to get over in order to pass your endpoint assessment, the conditions, the assessment duration, the assessor requirements. So what does the person that's assessing you need to be able to have? And occupational competence is obviously quite high on that list of things. Any reasonable adjustments for certain candidates with additional learning support needs, and how the endpoint assessment hurdles are graded as well. So you need to understand your apprenticeship's assessment plan, know the types of assessments that are going to take place, and the all-important criteria that your endpoint assessor is looking for evidence against. If you don't understand that when you're going into your endpoint assessment, you are going to struggle. You may well do excellently within your workplace and brilliantly on your degree program. If you then ignore your assessment criteria for your endpoint assessment, you're not going to be successful in the same way you might have been on program with your employer or with the university or the training provider you've studied with. So the assessment plan will give you the rules about everything that's going to be conducted, what resources you can take into your assessment to support you during that time. So it's really important that you understand it, your training provider understands it, and also that your employer understands it as well, to give you the best opportunities to be successful. So this is an interesting kind of concept. So then in some apprenticeships, the knowledge, skills, and behaviour criteria are a good guide for what you need to learn. But the devil is in the detail. So you are not in all situations going to be assessed against knowledge, skills, and behaviours. For every single apprenticeship program and the assessment plan, there are a set of assessment criteria, and that is what the endpoint assessment organisation is looking at. That's how they are going to assess you. They're not going to bring up the KSBs on that front page of iFATE, like we just looked at, and ask you specifically questions about that or poke you and prod you about those. They are always going to refer to the assessment criteria. So the knowledge, skills, and behaviours will help you to develop your competence. Then you need to focus on the assessment criteria once you get through that gateway into your window, your EPA window. Okay, so during your program, you are ticking these boxes off. You have definitely strong evidence in those knowledge criteria, skills, and behavior criteria. Fantastic. So that is the evidence collection process of the KSBs during that practical period. And you may well be given by your training provider a log or some kind of electronic portfolio where you can tick off against the different KSBs the evidence that you have created that supports the fact that you are working at that level. So the KSBs, they are typically outlined in the apprenticeship standard. They provide that clear framework for you that you need to strive to achieve, and that you'll be assessed during the practical training period for you. So those on-program assessments are going to definitely be against those KSBs. However, your training provider should always have an eye on the assessment criteria for your endpoint assessment. So there are two parts to what we're doing here. If that evidence is collected well and it also supports you with the assessment criteria, that's great, because that's great resources for you to take in to those assessment hurdles where you can be supported by particularly portfolios of evidence. So something like this log you can see on the screen will definitely help you understand where you're at on your journey. In this case, for this example, 60-month journey. You will know where the gaps are, where you need to focus your efforts. Obviously, as time goes by, most of these things will be ticked off, but you can see where you need to focus on. And then you'll be able to use that with your employer to demonstrate to them that you have achieved all the elements of your program. And they obviously will be able to check that and sign that off as well. So there's lots of different ways that you can collect evidence, and we'll talk about that as well. We talked about the sign-off at Gateway, so this is just a typical example of something, and the apprentice, the employer, as I said, the training provider will sign, and also you'll sign that you're happy that you've completed everything and it's been properly reviewed, and that information will go to the endpoint assessment organisation. So during the programme, that long period, assessment has a slightly different definition. So the term assessment refers to the variety of methods or tools that your training provider will use to evaluate and measure you during programs. Some of that might be via them directly observing you. It might be through reflective or written statements where you might provide evidence and then contextualize that evidence. It might be through recorded professional discussion between you and the training provider, or you and somebody at your place of work. It could be witness testimony by a line manager or a supervisor or a mentor in your workplace as well. So all of those things can add up as evidence of the assessments that have taken place. Okay. Now we've got that out of the way, we can kind of focus a little bit more on the assessment types, the criteria, and how that thing is going to be graded, how your endpoint assessment is going to be graded. So hopefully everybody's still with me as we focus on this part of the session. So endpoint assessment definition then is slightly different. So this term is used particularly in apprenticeships when referring to the final assessment and whether or not somebody has actually achieved the skills, knowledge and behaviours. So it is a really precise way of measuring your skills, knowledge and behaviours on that programme. We may well use and lean on some of that on-programme evidence, but it'll be the evidence from the assessment hurdles that will go forward to your grading. So, for example, we might review a portfolio to help us contextualise some questions and as a springboard to investigate more how competent you are, but it will be how you respond to the questioning at the time that will be judged and graded and lead to your success or otherwise during your endpoint assessment. Okay, so the purpose of endpoint assessment then, this is the reason that it's there, and it's effectively to ensure that apprentices are occupationally competent, that you've developed the skills, knowledge and behaviours that are required to perform your jobs, and that endpoint assessment is there and designed specifically to test that, and that you are competent, and primarily that you're safe to work in that chosen occupation. It's also there to promote a consistent approach. It's carried out by independent qualified assessors following that standardized process, and everybody that comes through that program, whether they're being endpoint assessed by Marshall Assessment or by other endpoint assessment organisations, the process should be fair, reliable and consistent for all apprentices. So it's really important that that takes place and that is actually what's happening. So it also is there to provide a level of quality assurance, and is a mechanism that helps ensure that the apprenticeship standards are maintained, or those high standards are maintained. Assessors, being experts in their field, have been trained to assess competently against a national standard, and that those standards are being upheld. It's important to the credibility of apprenticeship programs in England that endpoint assessment takes place, and that we are improving the level of and the standard of those individuals that go into that industry, into that scientific sector in this case. So it does play a pretty critical role in confirming that apprentices have met the standard and that they are occupationally competent. Okay. So different hurdles. So in level 6 standards, what is very much often the case is that the first assessment hurdle that you will be faced with is to create a report or respond to a specific scenario or case study and produce a report or a report from a project. So that type of assessment is quite important. And what it does is it enables the endpoint assessment organization to look at a set of KSBs where the work cycle normally is too long to be observed. So if you work on a particular project or you work in a field where results take days or weeks to be collated and impact to be assessed, it wouldn't sit very well as an observation or as a very good way of assessing you. So what a project can do is allow you to create a report, submit that report, and we can see how you would approach a complex set of tasks that might take a long period of time for us in a very short space of time, all in one document. So it allows also for a broad set of knowledge, skills, and behaviours to be reviewed and assessed. So an example is in the level 6 laboratory scientist. It's called, and it's not particularly catchy, the Workplace Synoptic Project Primary Journal article, which also requires you to create a presentation of your synoptic project journal article and be questioned by an endpoint assessment panel. So yeah, quite a mouthful really. So these projects effectively are set by the employer or the training provider and then endorsed by the endpoint assessment organization. The projects themselves would need to be beneficial to the employer, so not something which is a task that you will do just for doing that task so that you can get through your endpoint assessment. It needs to contribute. It needs to be a real world project that you would get involved with. So the actual title of the project and the cut and thrust of it would be agreed with your endpoint assessment organization and your employer and training provider, and then you would then write that project up during a specific period of time post gateway. So this is mapped to various different areas and knowledge, skills, and behavior elements within your apprenticeship standard. And you can see in the table its assessment criteria. There are indicators for you to pass and indicators for you where you would score distinction in a particular element or assessment element. And also it talks about where there might be a lack of evidence and you failing that particular assessment element. So here, the first one, the KSB 12, that's what it links to, back to the front page of iFate. And the pass criteria is that you've demonstrated a systematic analysis of relevant scientific literature within the justified time frame. And further to that, distinction evidence, once you've demonstrated the pass, you will build on that critical analysis of relevant scientific literature across the field, evaluating the evidence and the relevance of that to your research. So that's the kind of information that you would need to have within your report. So what I would say is that if you are doing a BSc and you have to do a project in the final year of your degree, that would be very good evidence, but the structure of that report will not lend itself entirely across to your endpoint assessment. You would need to make sure that when you are creating your report for your endpoint assessment, that you do have sections that clearly discusses the literature review, the project scope and definition, the experimental design, the data analysis, how you've drawn conclusions, and there are there are other assessment elements as well that aren't on the page, and that you've covered everything. If you don't cover a systematic analysis of relevant scientific literature, you will fail this element of your endpoint assessment. So you can't just take one thing from your on program and then use it for your endpoint assessment. The chances are they will not be compliant with each other. So do make sure that you are putting enough thought and time to create your report for your endpoint assessment. So if we have a look at one of those criteria, let's look at element K5 and 14. The pass criteria is well-structured data analysis using at least one appropriate statistical technique, such as, and then it lists some of those. Now, it's not saying that you have to put those in, but those are some good examples for you. So if it lends itself, great. If there's something else that's a bit more relevant, then by all means, you use something else. So if we looked at this, what does that mean for the endpoint assessment organization and your assessor? What are they looking for? So you really do need to understand and have considered the assessment criteria, because your assessor will pore over every detail of that plan and they will follow it faithfully. So if you don't have data analysis in your project and in your report, you will not pass. Effectively, you will fail this criteria and this element of your endpoint assessment. So it is vital that you consider how you're going to build data analysis into your project. Okay, so you must demonstrate, given these criteria, data analysis that is commensurate with a degree level program. You cannot take an average, mean, median, and mode. You need to consider level 6 statistics or statistical analysis of the data that you've created. And then you need to be able to articulate why you have chosen that particular type of data analysis, that particular technique, and what was the impact? What did your data analysis tell you about the trend in your data that you have used within your discussion or conclusion, your findings effectively? So that's really important. And actually, these criteria are there for you on day one of your program. So they're there for you. So you know exactly what the bar is that you need to get through or get over well before you get anywhere near your endpoint assessment. So there's not many times where you'll be assessed in life where you already know exactly what you need to achieve in order to be successful. But here you have. So if you don't spend time doing it, you obviously are reducing your opportunity to get a really good grade at the end. Another hurdle, and there are only two in this, the other hurdle for the level 6 laboratory scientist is the vocational competence discussion, or VCD. Quite often in almost all of the scientific apprenticeships, the endpoint assessment has some kind of discussion with yourself and the endpoint assessor. So two people discussing how best to get evidence against assessment criteria. Now, at level 6, you are not expected to be a passive responder to questioning. You are expected to understand the elements that you are being questioned around and respond to that by giving detailed responses and leading the conversation. So an example of that might be a question around compliance, and you'd start talking about the different regulations, how you live up to those regulations, and then further to that, talk about why that's important and why or how, that following them positively impacts your organization, or not following them negatively impacts your organization, along with any customers and any other impacts that might be there by you not following the proper regulations. So you need to understand how you're going to respond to that and how you are going to lead that conversation. So the only way you can do that is by having reviewed the information. Now, the vocational competence discussion rules allow you to take evidence, which is your portfolio, into this conversation with you. Now, it is a timed event, so you will not be given huge amounts of time on every area that needs to be discussed. To give you an example, your endpoint assessor is told that they need to ask you of 8 questions. Now, there are lots of different areas that need to be discussed. So they are expecting you to be able to give them information. Once a particular area or topic of the apprenticeship standard is questioned, for you to lead the assessor through the evidence that you need to lead them through, so that they can obviously assess that. So your assessor is not going to be in a position to laboriously discuss assessment criteria with you until you demonstrate what is necessary. It is a timed event. If they did that, you would soon run out of time and you would fail the hurdle. You would need to retake it. So you can see how this kind of works. The emphasis is on you. This is a level 6. This is not a straightforward thing. You need to put some effort into it. And that is all level 6 endpoint assessments, not just those in science. They're all the same. The expectations increase at every vocational level. So that's exactly the same across the board. So professional discussions effectively then are assessing aspects of your occupation, of your role, that are difficult to observe or take place in restricted, confidential settings. It's those KSBs that don't naturally fall out of a report or a presentation about a project that you've done. So make sure that you're in a position to make what you do come alive. But remember, you do your job every single day. You're in the best position to talk about what you do, and hopefully it's your opportunity to show to your assessor exactly what you've learned and how you operate and how competent you are. Okay. So the advantages of this is that it's a bit more holistic. You get to showcase yourself in a fairly open conversation where you have first-hand experience. So it can be quite wide-ranging in scope. It can cover lots of your role, lots of areas of your role. Be ready to give real-life examples all the time. The other part of this is that almost every single time this will be done online, over Teams or Zoom or some kind of platform like that where it's recorded. And the benefits of having everything that's said recorded, including the questions, the responses, and anything that you want to show, is that it's there, it's recorded, and we can go back to it for quality control purposes, and obviously the assessor can go back if they've missed anything, and they'll review it before they then write up their final report and grading. So it's a really good way that nothing gets missed. Okay, so actual grading then, to kind of finish off this session. The actual grading for you obviously can be fail. You can fail both elements in this level 6 program, the laboratory scientist. In fact, almost all of the level 6 apprenticeship programs that I see in science only have 2 hurdles, and they're very similar to these. They might be called slightly something else, but that's the way it tends to be. There are some lower level ones that might have a 3rd hurdle in. Something like a knowledge test, for example, or an observation. But you can fail, pass, and there are some standards you can get merit, but at the moment, in this level 6, it is either fail, pass, or distinction. The merit doesn't exist, but it does for some standards. It is there. So you obviously need to be aware of how it's graded. If you fail one element, you may well pass the other. So you would only have to resit or retake the element that you failed. If you have failed one or both elements and you retake them, your overall grade will be capped at a pass. There is no mechanism for an apprentice to take their endpoint assessment, pass their endpoint assessment, and then ask to retake their EPA so that they can get a higher grade and then go for distinction. That will not happen. There is no mechanism for that to happen. So it's a one-shot thing. You can resit, retake, but you'll be capped at a pass. Okay. So So I mentioned the pass signifies that you've achieved the minimum level, at least the minimum level, and in this case, the distinction grade is the highest level of achievement. Now, it may well be that you get first in your degree and you pass your endpoint assessment. Now, you can see why there might be a disparity and you're getting an amazing grade for your degree, congratulations, but not getting a distinction in your endpoint assessment. They are two very different things. They are not connected to each other. And a lot of it is depending on obviously how well you prepare, but even if you prepare really well, how you perform on that day for your endpoint assessment. So don't be disheartened if you don't get distinction, even though you've got great grades in your academic qualification. The kind of number of people that get distinctions are quite low. It's a very, very high bar, and you will see from the assessment criteria why that is. You can see that through the wording of the assessment criteria, what it takes to achieve distinction. It is very possible, and every year people do, but it's a very, very exclusive club. It's a very high bar. Okay. So if you do fail your endpoint assessment, one or more elements, as I said, you can take a resit. If the endpoint assessment organization feels that you have done so poorly, they may ask for more learning and an action plan to be put together. So this might mean, excuse me, this might mean that a period of 8 to 12 more weeks might be needed. A training plan to correct some of the areas where we feel that you're quite weak, put into place, and then we will allow a retake to happen. If you feel that you are definitely competent and you have the support of your employer and the training provider, but you had a very bad day for whatever reason, then we may be able to look at speeding that timeline up. But it's very much a conversation between the training provider, employer, and the endpoint assessment organisation. So I'm not going to go through all of these. Time is running out, but the reasons for a fail grade usually are because not enough emphasis has been placed upon endpoint assessment during the programme. And the other side of that coin, the individual themselves doesn't put enough effort into kind of preparing themselves for it. There can also be other reasons as well. You could, as I mentioned before, be in the wrong environment in order to be successful for your endpoint assessment, where you are not being allowed to develop those key knowledge, skills, and behaviors because you're not in the right environment to do that. And if you miss out one of those things that's then needed for your EPA, you simply cannot pass. It's just that's just the way that it is. You just can't pass. So be aware of that. Be very, very clear about how your endpoint assessment is structured. Be very aware and focus on the assessment criteria. And if you do fail, you can redress that. You can improve. You can spend more time. You can be reassessed, and you can get across that line and complete your endpoint assessment successfully. Okay, so anybody that wants any more information, obviously these are some key websites. You can go to the government website. You can find information about how endpoint assessment organisations are quality assured. You can find some of the information about your particular apprenticeship on the iFate site. And also you can look at the Office for Students and Ofqual. Okay, very best of luck, everybody, and thank you for your time.